March 1603 was the moment when English history changed forever. 113 years of Tudor rule, a dynasty that had shaped modern England, was coming to an end. And in a chamber at Richmond Palace, a 69-year-old woman was living through her final hours. Elizabeth, the queen who had reigned for 44 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, transformed England into a world power, and refused every marriage proposal to instead wed her nation. Now alone and in pain, she faced the one thing that power could never conquer: death itself. But what made these final days so profoundly tragic? Who were the people at her side during her darkest hours? And how did one of Europe's most powerful monarchs die in fear and solitude, standing for 15 hours straight, because she was terrified that if she lay down, she would never rise again? We'll witness the final hours of the Tudor Dynasty tonight. Relax and let your mind drift as we step into Richmond Palace in 1603, where the history of an era quietly draws to a close in silence, and tears with the sleep story, The Last Days of Elizabeth. The great palace of Whitehall stood along the Thames in the winter of 1602, its countless rooms and corridors bustling with courtiers, servants, and visitors from across Europe. In the largest suite of chambers, Queen Elizabeth I still presided over her court, as she had for the past 44 years. To the outside world, she remained the formidable monarch who had guided England through religious turmoil, foreign wars, and countless political crises. But those closest to her could see what others could not. The Queen was failing. Imagine walking through those magnificent halls, the walls hung with tapestries depicting great victories, the ceilings painted with gold and azure, the floors polished to a mirror shine. And in the throne room, seated upon her chair of state, an elderly woman draped in silk and velvet, her face painted white with lead-based makeup, her fingers heavy with rings, her neck encircled by the massive ruff collars that had become her signature. This was Elizabeth in the 44th year of her reign. But look closer, and you might notice the tremor in her hands, the difficulty with which she rose from her seat, the way she sometimes forgot what she had been saying mid-sentence. The first signs of decline had appeared slowly, like the turning of the seasons. Elizabeth had always been remarkably healthy for a woman of her age. She rode horses, walked for hours in her gardens, and danced with her ladies well into her 60s. But by the autumn of 1602, something had changed. She complained of a persistent sore throat that made speaking difficult. Her voice, once so commanding that it could silence a room of arguing counselors, had been reduced to a hoarse whisper. She sipped constantly at soothing drinks prepared by her physicians, mixtures of honey herbs and wine, but nothing seemed to help. And she ate very little, pushing away plates of food that her servants brought to her chambers. Her godson, Sir John Harington, visited her at Whitehall that December. A poet and courtier who had known the Queen since childhood, Harington was shocked by what he saw. He wrote to his wife afterward, describing the change that had come over his royal godmother. "Our dear Queen, my royal godmother, and this state's natural mother, doth now bear show of human infirmity," he wrote. The phrase was carefully chosen. Harington couldn't openly say that the Queen was dying, but everyone who read his letter would understand what he meant. Elizabeth herself seemed aware of her decline. When Harrington read some of his latest verses to her, hoping to amuse her, as he had so many times before, she smiled only once, sadly. "When thou dost feel creeping time at thy gate, these fooleries will please thee less," she told him. "I am past my relish for such matters. Thou seest my bodily meat doth not suit me well. I have eaten but one ill-tasted cake since yesternight." It was a remarkable admission from a woman who had spent her entire reign projecting an image of timeless majesty. Elizabeth had always been acutely aware that she ruled in an age when many believed women were too weak to govern. She had compensated by creating a persona of superhuman strength and eternal youth. Her portraits showed her as ageless. Her face unlined her hair still red gold even as she approached 70. She referred to herself as married to England, transforming her decision not to wed into a political strength, rather than a weakness. And she had cultivated an almost mystical aura surrounding herself with symbolism and ritual that elevated her above ordinary mortals. But the truth was that Elizabeth was deeply, profoundly human. And like all humans, she was subject to the ravages of time. By the winter of 1602, she had lived through an extraordinary amount of loss. Her childhood had been marked by trauma. Her mother executed when she was barely 2 years old. Her father's volatile moods, the constant uncertainty about her place in the succession. As queen, she had watched many of those she loved die before her. Her beloved Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the man she had loved since childhood, and probably the only man she'd ever truly wanted to marry, had died in 1588. William Cecil Lord Burghley, her chief advisor and surrogate father figure for 40 years, had passed away in 1598. And just 2 years earlier, in 1601, she had been forced to order the execution of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, young, handsome, charismatic Essex, who had been her last great favorite at court. Each of these deaths had taken something from Elizabeth. Each had left her a little more isolated, a little more alone. And now, as 1602 drew to a close, she seemed to be collapsing under the accumulated weight of all those losses. Courtiers reported that she spent hours sitting silently in her chambers, staring into space. She forgot appointments she had made. She became suspicious, imagining that those around her were already looking past her planning for her successor. The question of who would inherit the throne after Elizabeth had haunted her entire reign. She had never named an heir. She had never married or produced a child. And she had ruthlessly suppressed any discussion of the succession, treating it as a form of treason. But now, as her health declined, that question became impossible to ignore. The Christmas celebrations of 1602 at Whitehall were subdued. Traditionally, the 12 days of Christmas were a time of feasting, dancing, plays, and masks. Elizabeth had always loved these festivities, often dancing until dawn and delighting in elaborate entertainments. But this year, she barely participated. She appeared at a few formal occasions, magnificently dressed as always, her face painted, her gowns glittering with jewels. But those who knew her well could see that she was simply going through the motions. The spark, the vivacity that had made her such a compelling presence seemed to have dimmed. And then came the news that would push Elizabeth past the point of no return. On February 24th, 1603, Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, died at her London residence. She was the niece of Catherine Carey, Lady Knollys, who had been one of Elizabeth's closest companions. Catherine herself had served Elizabeth since the Queen's accession in 1558, 45 years of loyal, devoted service. She had been there through all the crises, all the triumphs, all the heartbreaks. She knew Elizabeth's secrets, her fears, her private self in a way that few others did. Imagine Elizabeth receiving the news of Catherine's death. She would have been in her private chambers, surrounded by her remaining ladies-in-waiting. Perhaps someone entered and whispered the news to her. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps she had felt it, the way people sometimes sense when someone they love is gone. However it happened, the effect on Elizabeth was devastating. According to Anthony Rivers, a contemporary observer at court, the Queen loved the Countess well, and hath much lamented her death, remaining ever since in a deep melancholy, that she must seem to be overtaken. It's a carefully worded statement typical of the circumspect language courtiers used when discussing the monarch, but read between the lines, and you can sense the depth of Elizabeth's grief. She had lost her last link to the early days of her reign, when she had been young, and everything had seemed possible. Catherine had been there when Elizabeth had first entered London, as Queen, cheered by crowds who saw in her the hope of a new era. Catherine had been there through the dangerous flirtation with Robert Dudley, through the crisis of Mary, Queen of Scots, through the terror of the Spanish Armada. And now, Catherine was gone, and Elizabeth was truly alone. The Queen's reaction to this loss was extreme, even by the standards of her volatile temperament. She refused to eat. She refused to change her clothes. She sat in her chamber day after day, sometimes weeping, sometimes simply staring at nothing. And she began to speak of her own sins, her own failures. Most remarkably, she spoke of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and rival, whom she had kept imprisoned for 19 years before finally ordering her execution in 1587. Mary's execution had haunted Elizabeth from the moment she signed the death warrant. She had tried to avoid making the decision for years, understanding that executing an anointed queen set a dangerous precedent. But in the end, political necessity had won out. Mary had been involved in too many plots against Elizabeth's life and throne. Still, Elizabeth had never been able to shake the feeling that she had done something terrible, something that stained her immortal soul. And now, in her grief and decline, those old guilt came rushing back. Sir Robert Carey, another courtier, recorded that Elizabeth shed many tears and sighs, manifesting her innocence, that she never gave consent to the death of that queen. It was a striking statement, Elizabeth protesting her innocence nearly 16 years after the fact, as if she were still trying to convince herself that she had done the right thing. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Elizabeth had signed the warrant. She had known what would happen, but she had also tried to create plausible deniability, hinting that it would be better if Mary died by some other means, so that she, Elizabeth, would not have to bear the responsibility. It was typical of her political maneuvering, but it had failed to ease her conscience. There were other disturbing reports from Elizabeth's chambers during these dark days. Elizabeth Southwell, One of the ladies-in-waiting later claimed that the Queen was haunted by visions of her own body, thin and wasted. She saw phantoms' shadows that moved when they shouldn't. And in a detail that seemed straight out of a Gothic tale, Southwell reported that a playing card was found on the Queen's chair one day, a card with a nail driven through it. The court took this as an evil omen, a sign that dark forces were gathering around the dying Queen. Whether these stories were literally true, or whether they were embroidered by frightened servants looking for signs and portents, they reveal the atmosphere at court in those final weeks. There was a sense of things falling apart, of the natural order being disrupted. Elizabeth had ruled for so long that few could remember a time before her. England and Elizabeth had become almost synonymous in the popular imagination. What would happen when she was gone? Would there be civil war as there had been after the death of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI? Would foreign powers invade, seeing England weak and leaderless? The uncertainty was terrifying. In mid-February, Elizabeth made a decision. She would leave Whitehall. She would leave the noise and bustle and crowds of the great palace where she had reigned for more than 4 decades. She would go to Richmond, a smaller, quieter palace up the Thames. Perhaps she hoped that the change of scene would help. Perhaps she simply wanted to be somewhere more peaceful. Or perhaps, on some level, she knew what was coming and wanted to face it in a place that had meaning. For Richmond Palace was where her grandfather, Henry VII, the first Tudor king, had died in April 1509. It was the place where the Tudor Dynasty had truly begun. And now, it would be the place where it ended. Richmond Palace had a long and storied history. A royal residence had stood on that site since 1125, overlooking a bend in the Thames about 9 miles west of London. But the palace that Elizabeth knew had been built by her grandfather Henry VII after a fire destroyed the earlier structure in 1497. Henry had been at court when the fire broke out, celebrating Christmas with his family and courtiers. They had been forced to evacuate in the middle of the night, fleeing the flames in whatever clothes they could grab. Rather than simply repair the damage, Henry had decided to build an entirely new palace, one that would be grander and more magnificent than anything that had stood there before. He had named it Richmond Palace, after the title he had held before becoming King Earl of Richmond. It was a deliberate choice, linking the new palace to the new dynasty. Richmond had been Henry's headquarters in exile before he returned to England and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. By naming his palace Richmond, Henry was creating a physical monument to his family's triumph, a statement in brick and stone that the Tudors had come to stay. And it was at Richmond that Henry VII had died in 1509, in a bedchamber overlooking the gardens he had so carefully designed. His son, Henry VIII, had inherited not just the throne, but all the palaces, including Richmond. And now, Henry VIII's daughter was returning to that same palace in the winter of her life, perhaps sensing that she would follow the same path as her grandfather. Imagine Elizabeth's journey from Whitehall to Richmond in February 1603. She would have traveled by barge on the Thames, the standard method of royal transport, in an age when London streets were crowded and dirty. Picture her sitting in the royal barge wrapped in furs against the February cold, watching the riverbanks slide past. The journey would have taken several hours, giving her plenty of time to think. Perhaps she remembered other journeys on this same river, traveling to the Tower of London as a prisoner in 1554, thinking she was about to be executed like her mother, returning in triumph in 1558 when she became queen. All the years of summer progresses, moving from palace to palace, showing herself to her people. And now this final journey to the place where Tudor kings went to die. Richmond Palace must have seemed quiet after the bustle of Whitehall. It was a smaller establishment with fewer courtiers, fewer servants, fewer hangers-on. Elizabeth retreated to the royal apartments, taking with her only a handful of her most trusted ladies-in-waiting. These were women who had served her for decades, who knew her moods and needs, who could be trusted to be discreet about her declining state. Among them were ladies like Mary Radcliffe, who had been with Elizabeth since the early days of her reign, and Philadelphia Carey Catherine Howard's sister. The first days at Richmond followed a pattern that would become increasingly disturbing as time went on. Elizabeth refused to participate in normal court routines. She didn't hold audiences. She didn't meet with her counselors. She barely ate picking at the meals that were brought to her chambers, and she began to show a strange fixation on her appearance, even as her body continued to deteriorate. Elizabeth had always been vain, famously so. She had insisted on being portrayed in her portraits as eternally young, eternally beautiful. As she aged, the gap between the painted image and reality had grown wider and wider. By 1603, that gap had become a chasm. But Elizabeth refused to acknowledge it. She insisted on full court regalia, even when she was physically unable to carry the weight of the heavy gowns and jewels. A Venetian ambassador who saw her during this period reported that she was absolutely covered in pearls, strands and strands of them weighing down her thin frame. Her hands, once slender and elegant, were now swollen with age and illness. And there was a particular problem with one piece of jewelry, her coronation ring. Elizabeth had worn this ring since January 15, 1559, the day she had been crowned queen. It was a symbol of her marriage to England, the tangible sign of her covenant with her nation. But in all those years, she had never taken it off. And now, with her fingers swollen, the ring had become embedded in her flesh, grown into the very tissue of her hand. Her physicians tried to remove it, but it was too painful. Finally, they had to cut it off, sawing through the gold band. When it finally came free, everyone present saw it as a terrible omen, the symbolic marriage broken, just days before the end. And then there was the makeup. Elizabeth had been using lead-based cosmetics for decades, the white ceruse that gave her that ghostly pale complexion that was fashionable among aristocratic women. By 1603, she was applying it more thickly than ever, trying to hide the ravages of age and illness. Contemporary accounts suggest that by the time of her death, she was wearing as much as an inch of makeup on her face, a hard white mask that cracked and flaked as she moved. It must have been grotesque, this elderly woman, painted like a puppet, denying reality, even as reality closed in on her. But underneath the vanity and denial, there was fear. Elizabeth was terrified of dying. She was terrified of what came after death. She had been raised Protestant, but she had lived through the Catholic reign of her half-sister Mary, and she had seen enough religious conflict to make anyone doubt. What if the Catholics were right? What if she had led England into heresy? What if she was damned? These fears, probably present throughout her life, became overwhelming in her final days. And there was another fear, perhaps even more immediate, the fear of succession. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth had refused to name an heir. She had watched her father execute people for even discussing who might succeed him. She had seen her sister Mary obsess over producing an heir, suffering through what may have been phantom pregnancies. Elizabeth had decided that the best way to maintain her power was to keep everyone guessing, never committing to a successor until absolutely necessary. But that strategy, so effective during her long reign, now became a source of terror. Who would rule after her? Would there be civil war? Would foreign powers intervene? And most terrifying of all, would her successor honor her memory? Or would they condemn everything she had done? The obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots. He was a Protestant. He was male. He already had experience ruling, and he had children to ensure the succession would continue. Elizabeth's chief minister, Robert Cecil, had been secretly corresponding with James since 1601, preparing the ground for a smooth transition. But Elizabeth had never officially acknowledged James as her heir. To do so would have been to admit that her reign was ending, that she was mortal, that the Tudor Dynasty would die with her. And that was something she couldn't bring herself to do, not yet, not while she still drew breath. The second week of March, 1603, brought a dramatic deterioration in Elizabeth's condition. She stopped attending chapel, something that had been a daily ritual throughout her reign. For a monarch who was supreme governor of the Church of England, this absence was shocking. The courtiers who still remained at Richmond began to whisper that the end was near. On March 9th, observers noted that Elizabeth was eating almost nothing, and that her mouth and throat were extremely dry, her chest hot to the touch. She hadn't slept properly in days. Instead, she had taken to walking in the palace gardens, even though it was still winter, and she was dressed in light summer clothes. Her ladies tried to convince her to come inside to rest, but she refused. She walked and walked, as if trying to outpace death itself. By March 21st, Elizabeth's behavior had become truly bizarre. That morning, she failed to appear at chapel. When her ladies went to check on her, they found her standing in her bedchamber fully dressed, refusing to sit down or lie down. They tried to persuade her to rest, but she shook her head. So they did the only thing they could think of. They covered the floor of her chamber with cushions and pillows, preparing for the inevitable moment when she would collapse. And then began one of the most extraordinary vigils in royal history. Elizabeth stood there in the middle of her room for 15 hours straight. 15 hours without sitting. 15 hours without lying down. 15 hours without any support. Just standing silent as her ladies watched anxiously and time crawled past. Try to imagine what that must have been like. Picture that room at Richmond Palace, the winter sun moving across the windows, morning turning to afternoon, turning to evening. Elizabeth standing in the center of the floor, her body swaying slightly, her face painted white, her eyes staring at something none of the others could see. The ladies in waiting sitting around the edges of the room, not daring to speak, watching their queen slowly crumble before their eyes. The cushions on the floor, waiting. The candles being lit as darkness fell. And still, Elizabeth stood clinging to consciousness, to life, with a desperate intensity that must have been heartbreaking to witness. What was she thinking during those 15 hours? Was she reliving her life, all those years of triumph and tragedy? Was she thinking of her mother executed when Elizabeth was too young to understand? Of her father, terrifying and unpredictable? Of her brief time of happiness as a child with Catherine Parr, before Thomas Seymour's unwanted attentions poisoned everything? Was she thinking of her years as a princess, always in danger, always watched, never sure if she would live to see another day? Of that terrible time in the tower, imprisoned by her half-sister, hearing the footsteps approaching her cell, and wondering if this was the day she would be led to the scaffold, like Anne Boleyn. Of her coronation, when she was 25 years old, and the whole world seemed to open before her. Of Robert Dudley, the man she loved but could never marry. Of all the decisions she had made, all the people she had sacrificed for reasons of state. Of Mary, Queen of Scots, waiting 19 years in captivity before the axe finally fell. Or perhaps she was thinking of something simpler and more primal. Perhaps she was just afraid of the pain that would come, afraid of the darkness, afraid that if she lay down, if she closed her eyes, she would never open them again. Better to stand, to keep moving, to hold on to consciousness for as long as possible. Because once she let go, once she surrendered, there would be no coming back. Finally, after 15 hours, Elizabeth's body simply gave out. Her legs buckled. She collapsed onto the cushions her ladies had so carefully arranged. And there she remained, lying on the floor of her bedchamber for the next 4 days. She couldn't speak. Her throat was too swollen. She couldn't swallow the infection that was probably quinsy. A complication of tonsillitis had progressed to the point where her airway was nearly blocked. She could barely breathe each breath, a labored rasp that her attendants could hear across the room. Modern doctors, looking back at the descriptions of Elizabeth's symptoms, believe she was suffering from a severe throat infection that had turned septic. Without antibiotics, there was nothing her physicians could do except try to make her comfortable. They gave her broths and cordials. They adjusted the pillows and cushions to help her breathe. And they waited, knowing that there was nothing more to be done. On the evening of March 23rd, Elizabeth's counselors came to her chamber. They needed to know who would succeed her. The question could not be avoided any longer. England needed a king or queen. The transition had to be managed carefully to avoid chaos, so they stood around her makeshift bed on the floor, for Elizabeth had still refused to be moved to her actual bed, and they asked her directly, who should inherit the throne? But Elizabeth could not speak. The infection in her throat had robbed her of the voice that had commanded parliaments and silenced critics. She could only lie there struggling to breathe as her counselors named potential successors. When they reached the name of James VI of Scotland, something happened. Some witnesses claimed that Elizabeth gestured, raising one hand to her head in a motion that suggested a crown. Others insisted she made no sign at all. The truth, lost in the confusion and desperation of that moment, would never be known with certainty, but it didn't matter. Robert Cecil and the other counselors had already decided. They left Elizabeth's chamber and told the waiting court that the Queen had designated James as her successor. Whether she had or not, it was what needed to be said. The machinery of succession was set in motion. Messages were prepared. Fast riders were made ready. England would have a new monarch smoothly and peacefully, just as soon as the old one finally died. That evening, they finally convinced Elizabeth to be moved from the floor to her bed. It took several of them to lift her wasted body and settle her against the pillows. Once there, she seemed to give up the fight. She had held on for so long, controlling everything, refusing to surrender. But now, lying in the bed where her grandfather had died 94 years earlier, she let go. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Elizabeth's chaplains came to pray with her. They stayed through the night, reading psalms, offering comfort. And in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, as the candles burned low and the first light of dawn began to show in the eastern sky, Queen Elizabeth I of England died. One contemporary described it as dying mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree. After all the drama, all the fear, all the desperate clinging to life, the end, when it came, was quiet and gentle. Perhaps in those final moments, Elizabeth found some measure of peace. Perhaps the fear faded and she simply let go. The moment Elizabeth died, Richmond Palace erupted into carefully controlled chaos. The Privy Councillors who had been waiting for this moment immediately went into action. The palace was locked down. No one was to enter or leave without permission. This was partly for security reasons, but also to give the government time to manage the news and ensure a smooth transition. In Elizabeth's chamber, her 6 most faithful ladies-in-waiting prepared her body for burial. They washed her, dressed her in fresh clothes, and laid her out properly, but they refused to allow a post-mortem examination. This was unusual for a monarch. It was standard practice to open the body and examine the internal organs, both to determine the cause of death and to prepare the body for long-term preservation. But Elizabeth's ladies would not permit it. They were protecting her dignity, ensuring that the image of the Virgin Queen, untouched, inviolate, would not be compromised, even in death. Their caution was perhaps justified. Despite their best efforts, disturbing rumors began to leak from the death chamber. People whispered that the coronation ring had been so deeply embedded in her flesh that it had to be cut out after death. They said that her face, covered in an inch of lead-based makeup, had cracked and crumbled when the embalmer tried to touch it. Most gruesomely, there were reports that her body, sealed in its lead-lined coffin, had burst open within hours due to the buildup of gases from decomposition. Elizabeth Southwell, one of the ladies-in-waiting, later claimed that the coffin had been so full of noxious vapors that it exploded. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, they reveal something about how people thought about Elizabeth, even in death. There was a sense that something unnatural was ending, that the Queen, who had seemed to defy time and mortality, was finally revealed to be as human and corruptible as anyone else. The mask literal and metaphorical, had finally cracked. While Elizabeth's ladies tended to her body, the machinery of royal succession moved with remarkable speed. Sir Robert Carey, a distant cousin of the Queen, didn't wait for official permission. The moment he heard of Elizabeth's death, he grabbed a sapphire ring that belonged to the Queen, proof that his news was genuine, and mounted his horse. His destination, Edinburgh, Scotland, nearly 400 miles to the north, where James VI waited. Carey's ride became legendary. He covered the distance in just 3 days, changing horses whenever necessary, barely stopping for food or rest. At one point, near the town of Norham on the Scottish border, his horse stumbled and Carey was thrown. The horse's hoof caught him on the head, opening a deep gash that bled profusely. But Carey simply bound up the wound and kept riding. He reached Edinburgh on March 27th and delivered the news to James. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. Meanwhile, back in London, the official announcement was made at 10 o'clock on the morning of March 24th. Robert Cecil, standing in the courtyard of Whitehall Palace, read the proclamation to the assembled crowd. Queen Elizabeth was dead. King James VI of Scotland was now also James I of England and Ireland. The Tudor Dynasty had ended. The Stuart Dynasty had begun. The news spread through London like wildfire. People's reactions were mixed. Some wept openly. In the streets, Elizabeth had been queen for their entire lives, and they couldn't imagine England without her. Others were more pragmatic, already looking forward to the new reign and the opportunities it might bring. And some, particularly Catholics, who had been marginalized during Elizabeth's Protestant rule, hoped that James might prove more tolerant. Elizabeth's body remained at Richmond for several days, watched over by her ladies. Then, on a dark night, it was transported by barge down the Thames to Whitehall. The barge was lit with torches, their flames reflecting off the black water. According to one observer, the oars at every stroke did tears let fall. It was a poetic image. Even the river seemed to weep for the dead queen. At Whitehall, Elizabeth's body lay in state for 3 weeks. The coffin was placed in the Great Hall, draped in purple velvet and surrounded by candles. Courtiers and officials filed past in a steady stream, paying their last respects. Above the coffin was placed a lifelike effigy of the Queen, dressed in full royal robes, so realistic that many gasped when they first saw it. This was Elizabeth, as she had wanted to be remembered, magnificent, regal, eternal. The funeral itself was held on April 28th, more than a month after Elizabeth's death. It was one of the grandest spectacles London had ever seen. The funeral procession made its way through the city streets from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. The coffin was carried on a hearse drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet. Above it, the effigy of the Queen in full regalia, and the crowds. Oh, the crowds. Thousands of Londoners lined the route. They packed the streets so tightly that the procession could barely move. They hung from windows and perched on rooftops. They climbed onto walls and squeezed into every available viewing spot. And when they saw the effigy of their queen passing by, so lifelike that it seemed she might wake at any moment, something remarkable happened. The chronicler John Stowe described the scene. Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people. In their streets, houses, windows, leads, and gutters that came out to see the obsequy. And when they beheld her statue lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. This was genuine grief, spontaneous and overwhelming. These people were not mourning a symbol or an institution. They were mourning a person they had loved, a queen who had been part of their lives for so long that they couldn't imagine the world without her. Whatever Elizabeth's faults, and she had many, her people truly loved her. And in that moment, as her funeral procession wound through the streets of London, that love poured out in a wave of collective sorrow. At Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth was first laid to rest in the vault of her grandfather Henry VII. But in 1606, King James I decided to move her coffin and create a proper monument. He placed her in a tomb with her half-sister Mary I, the Catholic queen, who had imprisoned Elizabeth and nearly had her executed. It was an odd pairing, these two women, who had been such bitter enemies in life, now lying together in death. The Latin inscription on their shared tomb reads, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary sisters, in the hope of resurrection." It's a beautiful sentiment, and perhaps in death they found the peace and reconciliation that had eluded them in life. The tomb sits in the north aisle of the Henry VII Chapel, a magnificent example of Tudor architecture. Above the vault, a white marble effigy of Elizabeth lies in eternal repose, her hands folded, her face serene. It's nothing like the terrified, pain-racked woman who spent 15 hours standing rather than lie down for fear she would never rise. This Elizabeth is at peace. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death saw a smooth transition to James I, just as Robert Cecil had carefully planned. James made his way south from Scotland at a leisurely pace, stopping at various towns and cities, receiving homage, handing out knighthoods. By the time he reached London in May, he was firmly established as king. There was no civil war, no foreign invasion, no constitutional crisis. The system had worked, but in the decades that followed, something interesting happened. James's reign, which had begun with such hope, proved disappointing in many ways. He lacked Elizabeth's political instincts and her ability to inspire loyalty. He spent money recklessly where Elizabeth had been careful. He alienated Parliament where Elizabeth had managed it skillfully. And by the 1620s, people began to look back on Elizabeth's reign with nostalgia. They called it the Elizabethan Age, a golden era of peace and prosperity. They remembered the defeat of the Spanish Armada, conveniently forgetting the years of grinding war that followed. They remembered the flowering of English literature, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, without recalling that Elizabeth herself had been a sometimes capricious patron of the arts. They remembered good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, who had loved her people more than any man. It was a mythology, of course. The real Elizabeth was far more complex, vain, temperamental, sometimes cruel, often indecisive. She had presided over brutal campaigns in Ireland that killed tens of thousands. She had sent men and women to their deaths for religious reasons. She had vacillated over important decisions, sometimes with disastrous results. She was, in short, very human, with all the flaws and contradictions that implies, but she was also genuinely remarkable. She had survived a childhood that would have destroyed most people. She had navigated the treacherous waters of Tudor politics and emerged victorious. She had ruled for 44 years in an age when most people believed women were too weak to govern. She had transformed England from a second-rate power into a major player on the European stage. She had given her name to an age, and she had done it all while maintaining her independence, refusing to let marriage or motherhood define her, insisting on being judged as a ruler rather than as a woman. Richmond Palace, where Elizabeth died, no longer stands. Most of it was demolished in the 17th century, and today only a few fragments remain a gatehouse here. A wall there scattered remnants of what was once a magnificent royal residence. The room where Elizabeth spent her final days is gone, lost to time and decay. But the memory of what happened there remains. Perhaps when Elizabeth stood for those 15 hours refusing to lie down, refusing to surrender, she was thinking about her entire life. All those years of struggle and triumph and loss. All the decisions she had made, good and bad. All the people she had loved and lost. All the weight of 44 years of being queen. The burden of it. The loneliness of it. The terrible responsibility of it. Perhaps she was thinking about her mother, Anne Boleyn, executed on false charges when Elizabeth was not yet 3. Did Elizabeth remember her? Probably not, she was too young. But she knew the story knew what had happened, and she had worn a locket ring for most of her life, one that contained a tiny portrait of Anne hidden behind a door. Even when it was dangerous to honor her mother's memory, even when her father had declared Anne a traitor and a whore, Elizabeth had kept that secret portrait. She had known who she was, whose daughter she was. Perhaps she thought about Robert Dudley, the great love of her life. They had known each other since childhood, had been close, even before she became queen. When she ascended the throne, many thought they would marry. Dudley was a widower. Elizabeth was free. They clearly loved each other. But then Dudley's wife died under suspicious circumstances, and the scandal made marriage impossible. Even if it hadn't, Elizabeth had realized that marriage would mean sharing power, and that was something she couldn't do. So she had loved him and kept him close, but never married him. Had it been worth it? Had all the power and glory been worth the loneliness? Perhaps she thought about Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and rival, the woman she had kept imprisoned for 19 years before finally signing the death warrant. That decision had haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. She had tried to avoid it, had looked for any other solution. But in the end, political necessity had demanded Mary's death. Was it murder? Was it justice? Elizabeth had never been sure, and that uncertainty had poisoned her soul. Or perhaps in those final hours, Elizabeth thought about simpler things. The gardens she had loved to walk in, the music she had enjoyed, the dances she had led at court, the books she had read, the conversations she had had with clever people, the moments of genuine happiness that had punctuated a life defined largely by duty and sacrifice. Perhaps at the end, it was those small joys that mattered most. When the crowds wept at her funeral, they weren't just mourning a queen. They were mourning the end of an era, the passing of something that could never come again. The Elizabethan age had been a time of energy and optimism, of exploration and discovery of new ideas and new possibilities. England had found its voice, its identity during those years. And much of that was due to the woman who had guided the nation through crisis after crisis with intelligence and determination. Elizabeth had been far from perfect. She had made mistakes. She had hurt people. She had been vain and petty and sometimes cruel. But she had also been brave. She had faced down foreign enemies and domestic conspiracies. She had maintained her independence in a world that insisted women should be subservient. She had created a public persona so powerful that it still resonates more than 400 years after her death. Imagine Richmond Palace on an early spring morning. The sun is rising over the Thames, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The gardens are coming to life after the long winter, with flowers beginning to bloom. Birds are singing in the trees. The river flows gently past, as it has for thousands of years, as it will for thousands more. In one of those upper chambers, a soul was released from its earthly burden. No more pain, no more fear, no more loneliness. Just peace, finally, after so many years of struggle. The Virgin Queen was gone, but her legend was just beginning. And today, when we look back across the centuries, we see not just a monarch, but a woman extraordinary and flawed, powerful and vulnerable, remembered and loved. The tears that fell at her funeral were real. The grief was genuine. And in that moment, politics and religion and all the other divisions that had marked her reign fell away, leaving only the simple human truth: a beloved figure was gone, and the world would never be quite the same. Rest now, Elizabeth. Your watch has ended. The Tudor sun has set, but your light still shines a beacon across the centuries, reminding us that one person with courage and determination, and yes, a fair amount of stubbornness, can change the course of history. The night deepens. The candles burn low. And in the silence of centuries, we can still hear the echo of those words that Elizabeth herself spoke so long ago. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. Sleep well, good Queen Bess. History has judged you kindly. Your people loved you, and your story will be told as long as there is an England to remember. March 1603 was the moment when English history changed forever. 113 years of Tudor rule, a dynasty that had shaped modern England, was coming to an end. And in a chamber at Richmond Palace, a 69-year-old woman was living through her final hours. Elizabeth, the queen who had reigned for 44 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, transformed England into a world power, and refused every marriage proposal to instead wed her nation. Now, alone and in pain, she faced the one thing that power could never conquer: death itself. But what made these final days so profoundly tragic? Who were the people at her side during her darkest hours? And how did one of Europe's most powerful monarchs die in fear and solitude, standing for 15 hours straight, because she was terrified that if she lay down, she would never rise again? We'll witness the final hours of the Tudor Dynasty tonight. Relax and let your mind drift as we step into Richmond Palace in 1603, where the history of an era quietly draws to a close in silence, and tears with the sleep story, The Last Days of Elizabeth. The great palace of Whitehall stood along the Thames in the winter of 1602, its countless rooms and corridors bustling with courtiers, servants, and visitors from across Europe. In the largest suite of chambers, Queen Elizabeth I still presided over her court, as she had for the past 44 years. To the outside world, she remained the formidable monarch who had guided England through religious turmoil, foreign wars, and countless political crises. But those closest to her could see what others could not. The Queen was failing. Imagine walking through those magnificent halls, the walls hung with tapestries depicting great victories, the ceilings painted with gold and azure, the floors polished to a mirror shine, and in the throne room, seated upon her chair of state, an elderly woman draped in silk and velvet, her face painted white with lead-based makeup, her fingers heavy with rings, her neck encircled by the massive ruff collars that had become her signature. This was Elizabeth in the 44th year of her reign. But look closer, and you might notice the tremor in her hands, the difficulty with which she rose from her seat, the way she sometimes forgot what she had been saying mid-sentence. The first signs of decline had appeared slowly, like the turning of the seasons. Elizabeth had always been remarkably healthy for a woman of her age. She rode horses, walked for hours in her gardens, and danced with her ladies well into her 60s. But by the autumn of 1602, something had changed. She complained of a persistent sore throat that made speaking difficult. Her voice, once so commanding that it could silence a room of arguing counselors, had been reduced to a hoarse whisper. She sipped constantly at soothing drinks prepared by her physicians, mixtures of honey herbs and wine, but nothing seemed to help. And she ate very little, pushing away plates of food that her servants brought to her chambers. Her godson, Sir John Harington, visited her at Whitehall that December. A poet and courtier who had known the Queen since childhood, Harington was shocked by what he saw. He wrote to his wife afterward, describing the change that had come over his royal godmother. "Our dear Queen, my royal godmother, and this state's natural mother, doth now bear show of human infirmity," he wrote. The phrase was carefully chosen. Harington couldn't openly say that the Queen was dying, but everyone who read his letter would understand what he meant. Elizabeth herself seemed aware of her decline. When Harrington read some of his latest verses to her, hoping to amuse her, as he had so many times before, she smiled only once, sadly. "When thou dost feel creeping time at thy gate, these fooleries will please thee less," she told him. "I am past my relish for such matters. Thou seest my bodily meat doth not suit me well. I have eaten but one ill-tasted cake since yesternight." It was a remarkable admission from a woman who had spent her entire reign projecting an image of timeless majesty. Elizabeth had always been acutely aware that she ruled in an age when many believed women were too weak to govern. She had compensated by creating a persona of superhuman strength and eternal youth. Her portraits showed her as ageless, her face unlined, her hair still red gold even as she approached 70. She referred to herself as married to England, transforming her decision not to wed into a political strength, rather than a weakness. And she had cultivated an almost mystical aura surrounding herself with symbolism and ritual that elevated her above ordinary mortals. But the truth was that Elizabeth was deeply, profoundly human. And like all humans, she was subject to the ravages of time. By the winter of 1602, she had lived through an extraordinary amount of loss. Her childhood had been marked by trauma,